The general ignored her rifle until a hidden marking revealed a truth he couldn't ignore. General Harlan Briggs was not a man who wasted time. Every minute of his day was planned. Every meeting had a purpose. Every handshake had a reason. He had spent 32 years in the United States Army, moving from one duty to the next with the kind of focus that left little room for anything soft, for sentiment, for pause, for the kind of quiet moment that sneaks up on a person and changes something deep inside them. So when he arrived at the Veteran Heritage Exhibition at Fort Benning, Georgia, on a bright Tuesday morning in October, he told his aide, Major Corrine Ellison, that he wanted to be in and out within the hour. There was a ribbon to cut, a short speech to give, and a room full of donors and volunteers who deserved a firm handshake and a grateful nod. That was all. The hall was large and warmly lit. Long tables covered in green cloth ran in neat rows from one end of the room to the other. On top of them sat hundreds of objects donated by families from across the country, old medals in velvet boxes, leather-bound letters tied with string, black and white photographs in cracked frames, worn canteens, folded flags, and boots that still carried the shape of the feet that had once filled them. It smelled the way old places do, like wood and time and something that could not quite be named. Briggs walked slowly down the first aisle, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression polite but distant. He nodded at volunteers as he passed. He paused briefly at a display of medals from the Korean War. He leaned forward to read a typed letter from a soldier who had written home 3 days before he was killed. He straightened up, pressed his lips together, and kept walking. He almost did not stop at table 34. There was nothing about it that called out to him. The table held a single item, an old Springfield rifle, the kind issued to soldiers in the Second World War, resting in a simple wooden cradle. The stock was dark and worn smooth. The metal was clean but showed its age. It was the kind of object a person could walk past 100 times and never really see. Standing a few steps away from the table was a woman in a blue cardigan. She was in her early 70s, with silver hair pulled neatly back, and she stood with her hands folded in front of her, watching people walk by. Her name was Dolores Vasquez. She had driven 4 hours from Savannah to be at the exhibition that day. She had not told anyone that the drive had been the hardest thing she had done in years, not because of the distance, but because of what she was leaving behind when she walked through those doors. The rifle had belonged to her father. Briggs glanced at the placard beside the rifle. It read, "Donated by the family of Corporal Miguel A. Vasquez, U.S. Army, 1944-1946. He nodded once, the way a person nods at something they have filed away without truly reading, and moved on. Dolores watched him go. She was not surprised. She had been watching people walk past the table all morning. Miguel Vasquez had come home from the Pacific in the summer of 1946. He was 24 years old, thin from months of island heat and short rations, and quieter than his mother remembered. He had fought in the Philippines during some of the most brutal campaigns of the war's final years. He had carried that rifle through mud and rain and days that he never, not once, described to another living person. He received no ceremony when he came home, no parade, no formal recognition. His service record was thin in the way that many records belonging to Hispanic soldiers of that era were thin, not because they had done less, but because the system around them had often chosen to record less. The commendations that should have been recommended were not. The names that should have appeared in reports were left blank. Miguel had understood this even at the time. He had not expected it to be any different. What he had done instead was keep the rifle. He cleaned it every few months. He wrapped it in a soft cloth and stored it in the back of the cedar closet in his bedroom, behind his good shoes and an old coat. When Dolores was a little girl, she once asked him why he kept it. He looked at her for a long moment, the way he always did when he was deciding how much to say, and told her only, "Because it remembers what I did, even if no one else does. She had not fully understood that then. She was beginning to understand it now. It was a 19-year-old volunteer named Caleb Marsh who changed everything. Caleb had been assigned to photograph and log every artifact at the exhibition for the digital archive the museum was building. He was careful and thorough, the kind of young person who reads instructions all the way to the end before starting. When he reached table 34, he lifted the rifle carefully with both hands, turned it so the light from the overhead fixture fell across it evenly, and began recording the serial number on his clipboard. That was when he saw it. On the underside of the stock, near the pistol grip, scratched into the wood in letters so small they were almost invisible, were 3 sets of initials, a date, and a single word. MAV, RTD, CLH, June 12, 1945, Leyte. Caleb stared at it. He turned the rifle slightly to make sure he was reading it correctly. He was. He photographed it from 3 different angles, wrote it down exactly as it appeared, and then went to find the exhibition coordinator, a woman named Sandra Park, to ask if she knew what it meant. Sandra did not know, but she knew someone who might. Dr. Patris Odom was the military historian attached to the exhibition. She was a small, precise woman who had spent 20 years studying the records of soldiers, whose stories had been misplaced by history, soldiers who had served with full courage and received, in return, silence. When Sandra showed her the photograph on Caleb's camera, Dr. Odom looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she asked for a printed copy and excused herself. Over the next 2 days, she worked through military records, unit logs, and archive databases with the kind of patience that comes from years of practice. RTD and CLH, she found, were almost certainly the initials of 2 soldiers from a support unit that had operated near Miguel's position on Leyte Island in June of 1945. Their names were Raymond T. Decker and Charles L. Haverford. Both were listed as having survived the war. Decker had been wounded in an ambush on June 12, 1945, the exact date scratched into the rifle stock. Haverford had pulled him to safety. The after-action report from that day was brief. It mentioned the ambush, the wound, and the rescue. It credited Haverford for the extraction. And then, in a single line that had likely been written quickly and never reviewed again, it noted that covering fire had been provided by an unassigned auxiliary, allowing the rescue to take place. No name, no rank, no follow-up. Miguel Vasquez had stood alone for 11 minutes, holding a position against enemy fire so that a man he barely knew could drag another man to safety. And the official record had given him 3 words: unassigned auxiliary. He had given himself something better. He had scratched his initials into the rifle he used that day, alongside the initials of the 2 men whose lives that rifle had helped protect. It was the only record he ever made. It was meant for no one, or perhaps for everyone, or perhaps simply for himself. Proof, pressed into wood, that it had happened and that he had been there. Dr. Odom called General Briggs's office on a Thursday afternoon. She was transferred twice before reaching Major Ellison, who listened carefully and promised to pass the information along. Briggs called back in 20 minutes. That was not something he usually did. He asked Dr. Odom to go through it again slowly. The date, the location, the initials, she did. There was a long pause when she finished. Haverford, Briggs said. His voice had changed slightly. It was quieter. Dr. Odom waited. Charles Haverford was my wife's grandfather, Briggs said. He lived in Tennessee. He passed away in 1991. I only met him a few times. He stopped. Then he continued. I was 10 years old the only time he ever talked about the war. We were sitting on his porch. He told me there had been a man in the Philippines who saved his life and the life of another soldier. He said the man had stood his ground alone and that without him, neither of them would have made it. He said he never got the man's name. He said he had carried that for 40 years. Dr. Odom sat very still on her end of the phone. He carried it, Briggs said again, almost to himself. And that man carried it too, just differently. General Briggs returned to the exhibition the following Saturday morning. He did not tell his office he was going. He did not bring Major Ellison or any staff. He drove himself, which was something he had not done in a long time. He wore civilian clothes, dark trousers, and a plain jacket, because he did not want the visit to become an event. He simply wanted to stand in front of that table and look at that rifle with the full attention he had not given it the first time. Dolores Vasquez was there again. She had come back without telling anyone she planned to. She had simply woken up that morning feeling that she was not finished, that there was something incomplete, and driven back. She was standing in the same spot in her blue cardigan, hands folded, watching the room. Briggs walked straight to table 34. He stood in front of the rifle for several minutes. He did not touch it. He leaned forward and looked at the underside of the stock, where Caleb had taken the photograph. He could just barely make out the scratched letters in the light. Then he turned and introduced himself to the woman standing nearby, not as General Briggs, just as Harlan. He shook her hand and told her his wife's grandfather's name, and he explained, as simply and clearly as he could, what that name meant, how it connected to her father, to that day in June 1945, to a rifle that had spent decades wrapped in cloth at the back of a cedar closet in Savannah, Georgia. Dolores listened without interrupting. When he finished, she pressed her hand over her mouth and stood very still for a moment. Then she lowered her hand and looked at the rifle. "He never told me what he did," she said. "He only told me that it remembered." Briggs nodded slowly. Charles Haverford never told anyone either. Except once, and even then he didn't have a name to give. "Now he does," Dolores said. They stood together at the table for a while, two strangers connected by something that had happened 80 years ago on an island in the Pacific, something that had been carried forward in silence and scratched into wood and wrapped in cloth and driven 4 hours and almost walked past, and then, at the last moment, seen. Dr. Odom filed a formal petition with the Army's Military Records Division the following week. The process required patience. Records had to be pulled from multiple archives. Statements had to be gathered. A historian had to verify the account through cross-referencing unit logs and the physical evidence on the rifle stock. There were months of waiting and several rounds of additional paperwork. But the case was clear, the evidence was real, and the people working on it cared about getting it right. 8 months after Caleb Marsh turned that rifle over in his hands and tilted it toward the light, Corporal Miguel A. Vasquez was posthumously awarded the Army Commendation Medal for his actions on June 12, 1945, on Leyte Island in the Philippines. The official citation described what he had done in full: the ambush, the position he held, the men whose lives his actions had made it possible to save. His name appeared in every line. There was no blank space. There was no unassigned auxiliary. There was only Miguel. The ceremony was held in Savannah on a Saturday in November, in a community hall with folding chairs and afternoon light coming in through tall windows. It was small and quiet. Several of Dolores' grandchildren sat in the front row. A few local veterans attended in uniform. A reporter from the regional newspaper was there with a camera. An officer in dress uniform stood at the front of the room and read the citation aloud, beginning to end. When he reached the part that described Miguel holding his position for 11 minutes under fire, the room was very quiet. Then he presented the medal to Dolores, who held it in both hands and looked down at it for a long time. General Briggs was there. He stood at the back of the room in civilian clothes, the same dark jacket he had worn the Saturday he returned to the exhibition. He was not listed in the program. No one introduced him from the front. He was there because he wanted to be there, because some things are not about rank or ceremony or the official record. They are simply about showing up. After the ceremony, when people were moving around the room and the grandchildren were passing the medal between them to look at it, Briggs made his way to Doller's. They shook hands again, the way people do when they have already said the important things and now just need to mark the moment with something simple. "He should have had this a long time ago," Briggs said. Dolers looked at him steadily. "He knew what he did," she said. "He just wanted someone else to know too. That is all he ever wanted." Briggs thought about that on the drive home. He thought about the difference between knowing something yourself and having it known. He thought about Charles Haverford sitting on a porch in Tennessee in 1974, telling a 10-year-old boy about a man whose name he did not have, carrying that story for decades like a debt he could never fully repay because he did not know where to send the payment. He thought about Miguel Vasquez wrapping a rifle in cloth and putting it in a cedar closet and telling his daughter that it remembered, even if no one else did. Both men had carried the same moment in different ways. One had carried it as a weight he could not put down. The other had carried it as a quiet insistence. "I was there, and it mattered, and someday someone will know that turned out 80 years later to be exactly right." The rifle now has a permanent home in the Fort Benning Heritage Collection. It rests in a glass case with a full placard beside it, one that names Miguel A. Vasquez clearly, lists his unit and his actions, and explains what happened on Leyte Island on June 12, 1945. The scratched markings on the underside of the stock are documented in the museum's official records. A photograph of them is mounted on the back wall of the display, enlarged enough that every visitor can read the letters without having to lean in. Next to the photograph is a small framed picture of Miguel in uniform, taken in 1944. He is squinting slightly against the sun. He is not quite smiling, but there is something in his expression that is steady and sure, the look of a man who knows what he is capable of and has quietly decided that is enough, whether or not the world takes note. For a long time, the world did not. Then a teenager named Caleb tilted a rifle toward the light. Then a historian named Patras spent 2 careful days in the archives. Then a general named Harlan picked up the phone and heard a name he recognized. Then a woman named Dolers drove back to a hall in Georgia because something inside her said the story was not finished. And it turned out it wasn't. It was only just beginning to be told.